Species. Unite.
I think one of the reasons dignity matters to animals is that they are objectified. They are stripped of their agency very often. And they're also caught up in power relations with human beings that do not go in their favour in the overwhelming number of cases. But it's also grounds why they have a right to be subjects of justice, doesn't it?
Yes.
So it is the fact that they are subjects, that they are agents, that their voices matter in a political sense.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. We have a favor to ask. If you liked today's episode and you have a spare minute, could you please rate and review Species Unite on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts? It really helps people to find the show. This conversation is with Melanie Challenger. Melanie wears a lot of hats. She's an artist and philosopher, a poet and a writer, vice president of the RSPCA UK, and deputy co-chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. And she is bringing her decades of experience in both science and the arts to come up with a solution to a big question. How can non-human animals be represented in the process of making crucial decisions that affect their lives? This project is called Animals in the Room. It began during the pandemic and is an international collaboration of philosophers, scientists, and animal welfare specialists who are working together to devise and test models for representing non-human animals in decision-making. And that is what she's here to talk about today. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, no, I'm delighted.
I'm really, really excited to talk to you. And there are so many things we could talk about because you're kind of a Renaissance woman. Like, you're a poet, you're a writer, you're a philosopher, a musician. You do a lot.
I do too much. Yeah, one of my dear friends, Saf, she's a lawyer, and she said to me, "I think you may have too much career, Mel." Which is it's true. I mean, it was completely accidental. You know, I came out of the arts. That was where I started, and that's where I thought I would stay. But you know, the work that I was doing as a poet and as a librettist when I was younger was always touching on questions of natural history, of moral philosophy around the living world. And so that kind of segued quite naturally into nonfiction. My nonfiction is kind of history of ideas around natural history, you know, history of science, philosophy of science. Inevitably, that led to a kind of ethnography that pushed me in the direction of ethics. And so I have this like really bizarre expanded portfolio of work that feels logical to me, but I realize on the outside probably looks a little bit nuts. But
it doesn't, because it does all connect.
Yeah.
But to go from before you were nonfiction, you were fiction, and your poetry and music, to writing books like How to Be Animal, really about what it means to be human.
Yeah.
Right. It makes sense when you say it, but it's a big scope of work.
It is, yeah. And I'm not going to lie, it's tiring. It is tiring, actually. I think just probably the energetics that I require, I think all of the mothers of the world will know what I'm talking about also, you know, that ability to hold in mind so many sort of, you know, areas of need or interest simultaneously is just, it's mentally tiring, isn't it? And so switching between the modes can be a little frustrating in some ways, you know, because they are very different ways, you know, just ways of imagining and thinking through the world. But as you say, the question, the sort of line of inquiry is the same, actually. It's just coming in different forms.
And so naturally you kind of just one became another, and one question led to another.
Yeah, very much so. But I still feel like I'm ultimately a creative, even though I've like really gone very far. I work in policy facing work now. I've gone really far, from that place. But I think that's probably it. I'm probably creative at a core, I would say.
I think even with this current project that I want to talk about today called Animals in the Room, it asks for a lot of creativity.
I'm really glad you said that, actually, because I feel being in the city, when I first came to this city, I love New York. And when I first came to this city many years ago, I was a poet. And I was kind of really relatively fresh out of doing a literature degree. I was purely in an arts world. And I sort of, over the years, each time that I've come back, I've been coming back for different reasons very often in different aspects of my working life. But they've always been separated out from one another. And even one of the things that I find frustrating about the different modes that I work in is that when I'm deputy co-chair of our national bioethics body, which is, a very particular kind of working and intellectual environment, very different to working on an opera, let's say, completely different community of practice going on in either. And one of the joys of this project that I'm working on now is that the arts are really at the heart of it in a lot of ways. Plus, we're very focused on policy impact, and plus we're working on scholarly kind of ideas. And it's like I feel like finally I'm knitting everything back together again, which is really exciting.
Will you explain first what it is, and then we'll kind of take it apart?
Sure. So Animals in the Room has the name that it does. And I should say the wider work that we're doing isn't only animals, but our kind of primary focus and where this began was very much around all of these different human rooms where we make crucial decisions that are critical to the lives of other beings. So it could be the UN Assembly, it could be an ethics committee, it could be just our own rooms in our homes where we make choices over what we're going to buy, what we're going to eat, what we're going to do. In all of these rooms, we are making decisions about other members of our community. We don't just live in a human community, we're in a multi-species community. And yet, while we might have, say, a welfare representative, a kind of trustee on behalf of animals as part of, making sure we have a diverse field when we make decisions, that is not the same as bringing those other beings as subjects of justice, taking a kind of delegate model, representing and including with them, co-designing what it looks like to bring their voices into those spaces in order to make decisions, or even just taking their perspectives properly before we go through a process. So Animals in the Room is based on a principle that when we make decisions critical to other beings, their voices should be represented, they should be included in the process in a much more substantial way than we have been talking about up to now. And the assumption is that is critical to how we move forward in a more just and sustainable world. So, and that's easy enough to say, right? But actually, how do you bring, grey wolves into the room? How do you speak for corals that are deep in our oceans? How do you engage crocodiles, estuarine crocodiles, in a decision-making context in a democracy? We have some ideas, but we don't know. So the work of Animals in the Room is to imagine how we do that, to design how we do that, and then crucially to evaluate what works, and in the hope of moving towards, an evidence-based practice.
Okay, so let's go back.
Okay.
Tell me about how this started and what was going on, who was saying what, and how did this become something?
Sure. Well, it started in the pandemic. I had spent 2 years on a genome editing farmed animals project within Nuffield. And we have a very robust, fantastic model of consultation, evidence scoping within Nuffield Council, which was really well done for this process. And it's very difficult, a lot to think about. We don't have any frameworks ethically, really, for even dealing with what it means to gene edit or genome edit other living beings, to have chimeric animals that are part, where we've kind of engineered part little bit of one animal and spliced it in with another animal, and purely for utility oftentimes. We don't really have the mental apparatus to make sense of that. So it was a huge intellectual task as it was for the group, and I was incredibly proud of everyone that came together on that. But, and this is no fault of Nuffield, it's just the way that the whole of the world really works at the moment, there was no mechanism really beyond making sure we had people like compassion and world farming in the room and so forth. So we had diverse views. There was no mechanism for us to really take the perspectives of the animals that we were talking about. And it really felt wrong to me through that time. I felt that there was a problematic distance that was nobody's fault. And I don't think in any way undermines the work that we did either. But we can't know what it might have looked like had we gone through that kind of process. And so I started reaching out to people who were sort of leaders in their field, in the kind of academic world, who had been talking about representation or inclusion in different kind of forms. So people like Alfonso Donoso in Chile, who's a political scientist and has written a lot about sort of multi-species inclusion. Becca Franks at NYU, who works around kind of inclusive science and preferences of animals. So how we know what matters to them and how we do that in a very fair way. People like Daniel Sellermeyer in Sydney University, who's a multi-species justice expert. I sort of gathered people together. And actually, at first, we had a huge group. There was a kind of about 18 international scholars who were initially talking. And we started just sort of batting around ideas. And it slowly got down to a core group of us who were completely committed and had even though, as I'm sure you can imagine bringing a bunch of sort of philosophers together. You're going to do it's going to be very gassy. There's going to be a lot of talking.
A lot of talking. Yes.
Exactly. Me all the time being like, yeah, but let's think about, let's bring this into the concrete. We have different orientations. I think that's very necessary. But our core sort of principle of inclusion was shared. And we're just a really great international group of scholars spanning Africa to Canada. So then that was the kind of academic heart and the scholarly heart, which I think is very necessary actually for the foundation of this. But we then began to put the ideas out. I reached a point where I felt, let's just test this idea. Let's see if people think we're all nuts. Let's see how this goes. So I wrote a piece, which is actually for Emergence magazine, where I just, to engage publics really and just get a little sense of the response was overwhelming. I was getting just so many emails that I just couldn't keep up with it from all around the world, from Costa Rica, from people in Alaska, lots of different practices and walks of life who were like, this is what we need, something like this. This is desperately needed. But crucially, what I also started to get was people within particularly the conservation community. So a lot of people from some very mainstream organizations who'd done service in conservation for sort of 20, 30 years, saying we're at the end of the road here. We are exhausted. We spent 30 years trying to save these beings. Tolerance for conservation, let alone for coexistence, is trending down everywhere. We need something new. We have to have a different model. And that has been the start of what will be our real world experiments. So where we will actually be working with partners like that to trial inclusion and perspective taking and see how that reshapes the world around us.
And a lot of this, and you've written and spoken a lot about this, and actually have a new book you just edited about animals and dignity.
Yeah.
And then, like, at the moment, we don't give a lot of dignity to animals, right? We don't give a lot of dignity to humans in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
But and the need for that. Will you talk about that a little bit, because that feels like that's one of the big pillars of this whole thing. Is this will bring dignity, right?
I'm really glad you made that connection, actually. And not everybody does. And I think you're absolutely right. And it is a pillar of the work. So thank you for saying that. Yeah. So dignity, actually, in How to Be Animal, I kind of deconstruct dignity because, that's the work that I do as an intellectual, is kind of pulling these ideas apart, looking at their genealogy. And actually, through that deconstruction, I started thinking, God, actually, dignity is there for a reason. It captures something. So one of the complaints against dignity in terms of, which is, let's be clear, it is dignity that grounds human rights.
Yes.
So dignity is very crucial. And there are correlates of dignity in really most of the cultures that we find. There's something like dignity in a lot of human cultures, just under a different name. This isn't a construct of the West. This is a human orientation to one another and a way of trying to capture something about the way we relate. It's relational in that kind of way. People get dignity. They know what it means when they're in a vulnerable situation. We're going to see dignity being something that would be a very powerful concept for people right now who find themselves displaced from their communities or who are struggling, with climate change, end up as a climate refugee. In that situation where you're incredibly vulnerable or where the power structure is such that an individual is subject to power in a way that really touches on their core biology, really, their vulnerability as a biological being, that's when dignity manifests. And what dignity is, in many ways, I think, is a promise to respect the value of another being under any circumstances, no matter what's happening to them. It is about conferring respect status to another, particularly in their vulnerability. And to violate that is to exploit that power structure in a way that degrades and demeans and so forth. And we get that. It's difficult to just sum that up in a simple way, but we know what it is when we see it. I think where dignity is very powerful for other living beings is that they are so often vulnerable when they get snared up in the human world. They are so often vulnerable to being objectified, because that's a key part of what goes on with dignity violations, is the denial of the agency or the intelligence or the value, just the inherent value of another being, of another. I'm not even going to say sentient, just another agent in the world, a subject, a being. And that is so key. And you're right. I think one of the reasons dignity matters to animals is that they are objectified. They are stripped of their agency very often. And they're also caught up in power relations with human beings that do not go in their favor in the overwhelming number of cases. But it's also grounds why they have a right to be subjects of justice, doesn't it? Yes. So it is the fact that they are subjects, that they are agents, that their voices matter in a political sense.
Right. Okay. So we have the groundwork, but how does this happen? What are some of the ideas, but like in terms of actually making this a reality and something that will be really useful?
Sure. So I'll give a couple of examples of projects that we're working on at the moment to sort of, and I should be clear that a lot of the work that we'll be doing is working, figuring out what works and why.
Right.
In Kenya, in Africa, tolerance for coexistence with African savanna elephants is trending down. There are lots of reasons for that it is still sort of being established, but broadly, I think we can see that tolerance is an issue, certainly with certain key animals all around the world. Tolerance for bears in Europe, tolerance for wolves pretty much worldwide.
Everywhere,
yeah. So golden jackal in Eastern Europe, wherever we look, there are these coexistence dilemmas with very vulnerable groups of animals that are nowhere near what their ecological threshold should be. Yeah. So the social threshold, so the threshold at which we'll tolerate living alongside these other beings, is going down. and their communities are very vulnerable, despite many, many years worth of conservation practice and efforts and in these areas. So we need something new. And some of that is about listening to the communities that live alongside these beings, and including the beings as well in how we problem solve. You know, at the bottom of all of this is how a democracy works. We will always have conflicts of interest. We will not always get our own way. But what we should have in a healthy democracy is that everybody is represented, everybody matters equally, and we listen to one another. And what we work towards is solving a problem around that is fair and just, and in a fair and just process. Perspective taking, interestingly, for humans as well as non-humans, is a useful tool for that, not often done enough in how we do things. But so with elephants, what we would do is work with partners who, both local community leaders who know the elephants really well, and also scientists and conservationists who've been working with them for a long time, have a huge amount of data about their needs, preferences, the individuals themselves, and also just tons of footage. And so elephants don't just communicate vocally. They have a lot of very complex vocal communications. They have names for one another, for instance. But they also have Pacinian corpuscles, so these special cells in their trunks and in their toes and the heels of their feet that change shape when they make impact, which folds back up into the brain and is a means of communicating. So talking through your feet and talking through your trunk. And this is infrasound, so it travels over hundreds of kilometers. Elephants also move their body parts, so they signal with body movement, with touch, with the olfactory, so with smells and scents. Huge range, communicative repertoire. So we bring all of this, we bring the experiences of these beings together, and perspective taking will take probably very ritual forms as well. So we'll probably use theatre, the arts in some way, which is appropriate to the community for how dialogues take place in the community, and bring the community, human and non-human, together to take one another's perspective. So crucially, we listen to the human community as well. What's at the heart of the problems, really surfacing what's going on, making sure everybody's heard, everybody's voice matters, and then problem solving. So very much a democratic innovation, a sort of a community dialogue in which there would then, after a phase of perspective taking, there would then be deliberation from which hopefully we might get novel solutions, novel ways forward. And that's what we would be trialing.
When you're speaking on behalf of the elephants or representing the elephants, and even though, yes, they have all these ways they communicate, and we know this, and elephants are a great example because we know a lot about how they communicate, but they still don't speak, right? And so are there hurdles there in terms of animals, and clearly there's no language in the bigger project, not just elephants, but across the board?
Absolutely, yes. So there are lots of little bits that need to be properly understood. And that's why, ultimately, that's why it's right that it's scholarship that's at the heart of this, as well as the arts, because the arts is probably going to be we have to probably get a little bit experimental with how we represent. So it is not, to go back to the human model, and this is something that we face a lot within bioethics. Let's look at, for instance, when decisions break down around care for someone who's critically ill but incapacitated. Either they can't communicate because they're very, very young, or they can't communicate because they're in a vulnerable position in later life or after an accident or what have you. In those situations of care for the critically ill that cannot communicate and represent themselves, we've had to over time to get experimental with how we represent their voices. We never lose sight of the subjects. That's the key kind of psychological turn. We never lose sight of the fact that these individuals have interests, that they have needs, and that they have intrinsic value, nor do we lose sight of the fact that they still are capable of communicating their needs, but it's not going to come through straightforward conversation like you and I are having. So the representation is going to be more creative, and a lot of due diligence needs to be buffered around that. So I think we can learn a little bit from that and carry that over for animals that can't directly speak to us in that kind of way. We have to be a little bit creative about it, and we have to figure out what works and what can go wrong, and that can only be done by
trial and error.
Yeah. So how are we confident that we can make the knowledge claims that we make about what they want? So are we sure that we're really representing them? How, what works well and as a model, and all of those things need to be analyzed and understood. And that's a lot of the work that we would be doing.
And what about animals like farmed animals, which have probably the least dignity on Earth?
You're right. I've focused on wildlife, but actually a lot of the work that we need to do and is critical is in contexts that are like farming, food systems, so where animals are really caught up either working for us or living alongside us or being utilized by us. So also we're early stages of thinking through a project around rats as research subjects and research models. So there are so many places where an inclusive practice could be very important. How are the animals made present in the decisions that we make around what farms look like, around sustainability goals, around the EU's farm to fork strategy? In none of those decision-making arena are the animals really represented in a really substantial way. So that's incredibly important work. It's quite high stakes work.
It's super difficult too, because I think so much with especially industrial agriculture, the people working there are typically, there's not a lot of dignity in their lives, right? But also violence is so normalized because these animals are just going to be killed anyway.
Yeah.
And so it's like so many things working against the animals having any ounce of respect given toward them.
Absolutely. And you brought in the human element there, and I think that is very important. There was a couple of well-known studies and people like Amy Fitzgerald, who's a criminologist, who, I forget her name, but there was a really interesting PhD project that was around looking at the human toll of this was particularly for slaughter. We have nothing like that in the UK, for instance. I dug around a lot, and we have no real data on the psychological impact and consequences in behavior and so forth for the people who are ensnared in that part of it. I think we can infer from what data we do have in other studies that human beings are not able to make a sensible decision about who these beings are in that context. There isn't the space. They're not capacious enough for any kind of moral, ethical, or proper emotional engagement to take place. And so our equivalent of dehumanized, but de-animalized, de-mentalized, if you like, animals are completely robbed of their intelligence, agency, feelings in those kinds of contexts. And working out how we can make an intervention there is profoundly difficult if it's not even made visible to us. Yeah. So it's a huge challenge.
Yeah. I mean, the whole project's a huge challenge, but it's such a necessity. And the fact that we've just, this is the first time really that anything like this is happening is pretty amazing.
Yeah. I mean, that makes us a little worried as well, I have to admit. I think it's very, very, very important that we take publics along with us. I'm very big on public engagement. And when I say publics, I don't just mean publics who might instinctively agree with us. Right. I mean, I want to bring farmers along with us. I want to bring, everyone into the discussion. That's what fairness looks like. Everyone's voices should be heard, even if this is not an easy orientation or lens for those individuals to think through. So public engagement, bringing publics along with us is a really key part of what I think we'll try to do, while not allowing the human to start to foreground again. This is very much about other beings first and foremost. The good comes from them to us. It's not through a human cultural lens, because that's the other thing that's going to creep in straight away. well, we don't do this like this in our and so forth. We have to try as much as we can to quiet the human in this and just allow the world to speak, the living world and other living agents to speak for themselves. And we'll try and design the project from them in that way.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you for another example because, and I don't know if you've talked about this one yet. I'm sure it'll come up because it's worldwide, but in the US specifically, we hate wolves. Like, right. I love them. But
ridiculous about wolves as well.
Wolf hatred is so real. And it's not logical. They don't hurt humans. They kill some livestock, but it's 0.005% or something. And the hatred is seethingly like over the top. Right? And kids grow up hating wolves, like because their dads hated wolves or their moms hated wolves. It's so embedded in the culture to hate them. How do you even begin with something like that?
It's really fascinating with wolves because it's a little bit similar with big cats. There can be real struggles with big cats also around the world. I think, if we take a step back and look at human beings more broadly, from what we can see from the, what is otherwise sparse data, humans and probably pre-human beings, so hominids, upright walking primates, which were more varied than they are now with just Homo sapiens, but once upon a time there were more humans than only us. And yet humans don't appear to live too well with a direct competitor, so another social, smart mammal in particular, in the environment. So some of it is competitive, I think. Wolves work together to eat the same stuff as us. Yeah. I mean, obviously they aren't so diverse and they're not generalists in their diet in the way that we are, but they like to eat sheep. They like to eat, they will take down the kinds of animals that have been corralled into an environment conveniently enough by us. And so in those threshold areas where we live alongside a direct competitor like that, it becomes completely irrational. It's an irrational response to an immediate kind of competitor. And we see that completely worldwide. And the tolerance for wolves is insane. When I was talking to a lot of conservationists across Europe, just to do some evidence scoping around brown bears in Europe, where there's also a lot of tolerance issues, and there's tolerance issues with bears in North America too. But it's nothing like, it's kind of is bobbing around like 30% to sort of, in some places where it's better, maybe 60% of tolerance for bears, depending on the kind of food practices in the area. But everywhere for wolves, it's zero.
Yeah.
So how do you do anything about that? Well, just perspective taking in a high stakes situation where there's zero tolerance is I think the hypothesis can be that's not going to be enough. Interventions younger, I think you said a really key thing, which is that children are raised to have these attitudes. I think a lot of our work would probably start in an educational setting. So take young people for a week into the environment, let them observe in a respectful way, teach them perspective take with them over time, and track what that does to their attitudes. Track how long. I'm going to stick my neck out and say the attitudes will shift. I can guarantee if they perspective take, the attitudes will shift. But how long does that effect last for before they flip back into a negative mindset? So there's lots of things. Basically, the only way to do it well will be to have it last, because you can have a management plan go in. You can use that sticker to the problem. But then you get another government come in and the management plan will go again. Exactly. So there's, It's not enough just to attack at the political or the legal. You've got to get the psychology. And a lot of our work is a psychological turn. That's where we're doing the intervention. So to do that with wolves, we're going to need to take a multifaceted approach and really understand what will move us away from what is, as you've said, actually an irrational response to a beautiful, intelligent, living being, many of whose ancestors we live with and call names and have as family members and spend trillions of pounds on in this country.
Yes, no, it's so true. It makes it all the more baffling, right?
So we need to understand why. So
Right.
that's what you need evidence for. And then you build a framework from the
Right.
evidence.
And so, okay, so then you get the evidence, you understand the why. And then kind of case by case, it depends on the species, the place, in terms of what happens next.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, what we don't know at the moment is how much of this is generalizable with a framework. So how
Right.
much, if we do a piece of work with a mixed or an indigenous community in Africa, a kind of local led project there, what comes out of that? How much does that fit with maybe a much more sort of controlled, facilitated piece of work in Europe, or something in a very specific setting like, an ethics body or the UN or wherever it might be? How much are we seeing the same sorts of impediments that humans have with perspective taking, the same, key things that we don't know at the moment? Democracy is still a really amazing tool for pro-sociality and problem solving across lots of different interests. It's a beautiful thing. And yet we've been experimenting with human democracy for 2,500 plus years. I think we can give ourselves a bit of time to experiment with how we do this to include other living beings in our democracies. And that's what we hope to do.
It'll definitely take time. Although I think there'll be a lot of people who are impatient.
Yeah.
Because it's so long overdue. And there'll be a lot of resistors, for sure. Because a lot of people like to keep animals over here.
If we really do take that radical step that is a necessary step of including them in our decision-making arena, that is the world is not going to look the same, and people will fight against that. There will be changes. There will be significant changes.
And the end result, is that the end result, like the dream end result, is them actually having a seat at the table and them being considered, like, legally, policy-wise, psychologically?
Yeah. The dream is that becomes normal. It's not something that just we do in our center in New York. It's like something that is normal practice, a normal assumption that for a just world that they should be heard and included.
So what are next steps then? So right now, where are you? And then what's happening next?
So right now,
I'm not one of the impatient people, but
tell me.
I need to know. When are wolves going to be?
When are you up? When are the deliverables? Some of our first experiments will be beginning in the latter half, so in this fall, so latter half of this year. And a kind of program of research will start to get underway also around sort of, in the fall of this year. What we're crucially doing at the moment is trying to make sure that the way we work across arts, technology, industry, policy, and the academic work within the centre, because we're kind of pulling on all of those methodologies and approaches, is very well designed. So at the moment we're still a little bit at the building stage, but we hope we're going to be getting underway as time goes on, obviously trying to get investment into it so we can get like more ambitious with what we do, trying to find more partners that we can work with who maybe want to have somewhere where something we can be quite nimble and get a little bit of data, get a little sense of something because they're already doing maybe or wanting to do something a little bit like that, but they need us to maybe support to evaluate something that they're doing themselves. So starting to build out the network.
So partnering with organizations like somebody who's already working with grizzly bears. So.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So it could be finding partners who want to do something like this or where there's a very clear mandate, or even just with like a grassroots organization that wants to have, has been thinking about having perspective taking or something like that, or including other beings on the board, let's say in a business. can work with us, and what we can do is evaluate that process and help them co-design something. And so building out our network, working with other individuals and groups who are interested or asking similar sorts of questions. So sort of building out the movement, if you like, in that way. And then building out the actual structure of the center so that it's robust and crucially it has longevity.
Yeah,
that's going to be the tricky thing in the short term.
I love it. I'm not going to be impatient, but I'm very excited for you to fix the wolf situation and all these others. No, but animals really, I'm teasing, but animals, I mean, this is very, like I said, long overdue and brilliant.
Thank you.
And I'm super excited. Thank you so much, Melanie.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. Yeah, really.
That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you very much.
To learn more about Melanie, to learn about Animals in the Room, and to read Melanie's books and learn about all of her other work, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We will have links to everything. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like to support the podcast, we would greatly appreciate it. Go to our website, speciesunite.com, and click donate. I'd like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knutson, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polke, Sam Kosel, and Anna Kolner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.